What if I told you you could get developers to work on your project for free and all you have to do is put the code on GitHub so they can see it and then contribute to it? Does that sound interesting to you? Good. Stay tuned because I'm about to launch a new course for $19.99 a month because of course this is continual learning where you're going to learn how to utilize developers to work for you for free. I love open source code. Sad reality is some of you actually want that course. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but that course doesn't actually exist, and open source is very far from free labor. I just finished working on a popular open source project called Doge House with over 400 contributors, and in this video I'm going to be going over the pros and cons and give you some criteria on whether you should open source your startup. You shouldn't, it sucks, and I hate open source. I wouldn't be surprised if a statistic came out that said like 90% of maintainers of open source projects, aka the person in charge, are overworked, underpaid, and have seasonal depression. And the season that they're depressed in is year round. Okay, it's actually not that bad, but I just feel like people that have never been involved in leadership of open source projects always look at it with like really green, rose tinted, whatever goggles and are thinking it's this great, wonderful thing. And the person in charge is just getting all these things for free. And no one realizes the hidden costs of operating everything. And as your project gets more popular and more people get involved, the cost that you pay increases. But instead of paying USD or fiat, as my crypto buddies like to call it, you pay in time. It's close to a full-time job to properly manage an open source project, and you'll find the amount of time you have to actually code becomes less and less and less until you're kind of just an open source manager and it's kind of miserable. There are 3 tasks that will eat up your time. The first is reviewing code that contributors want to merge into the project and making sure that it doesn't utterly destroy the project. Secondly, when bug reports or feature requests come in, you're going to need to categorize, prioritize, ask follow-up questions, or maybe even just close the issue altogether. Third is assisting new developers that want to get involved in the project. So this includes helping them get set up, assigning them work to do, and just answering any questions that they have. Personally, I got overwhelmed with all the work involved and just completely stopped helping new developers and looking at issues and only focused on reviewing code. The project definitely suffered because of this, and I'm sure there was lots of developers that wanted to get involved that just got ignored by me, but it was the only thing that I could do to get any coding done for myself. Another important thing to realize is you get what you pay for. And because you don't usually pay open source contributors any money, they are free spirits to come and go whenever they want and just work on stuff when they get some free time. The average open source contributor is pretty unreliable and won't know the code base that well, causing them to introduce bugs. And it's not really their fault, it's just a result of how the incentives are aligned. A developer will claim a task on an open source project and they might complete it tomorrow, next week, next month, maybe never if something comes up in their life or they just lose interest. Because of this, you usually don't give new contributors important things that need to be done. Instead, you kind of give them small features or bug fixes that it doesn't really matter when they get completed or if it never happens, they're just not that big of a deal. And the funny thing is, it doesn't actually get much better if they follow through and actually submit some code, because then all of a sudden you're spending hours going back and forth in the comments, giving feedback on something that doesn't even change the project at all, doesn't move it forward, and you could have finished in like 2 minutes. And so you just start questioning your life choices. Why am I doing all this and spending so much time on this meaningless thing? It's like, ugh. Don't get me wrong, I do think it's valuable to invest time in teaching developers, especially if they're going to be on a project for a little bit. But it feels like a huge waste of time because the majority of contributors will just disappear into thin air. And I don't blame them. They're not being paid. Like, I would do the same thing. One contributor that consistently works on the project is way more valuable than the hundreds of developers that do one task and then bounce. So it's super important to start identifying the consistent cardinals that are going to be there and teach them, spend time doing things with them, and ignore the grasshoppers that are just bounce, gone, bye. Productivity wise, I think just a small startup team of like 3 people can get a lot more done and do a lot more damage than these open source projects that have hundreds of developers that look like they're doing so much, but in reality, it's just ugh. You can set up an efficient open source project, but just know it's going to take a lot of time and effort that are going to take away from you driving your startup forward. It's going to be a distraction. I think it's too much for one person to code on a project, manage the open source, and try running a startup. I think you can try a max of doing 2 of those things, or just get some co-founders. So I would never open source a project with the intent of getting free work out of developers, because the work that you are going to be putting in to maintain everything is going to be equal to or maybe greater than the work that you get in return. Now, you may put your code on GitHub and just get absolutely no one contributing to it, or maybe just one or two people. And I think in a lot of ways, this is better because you avoid all the problems that I just described, but you still get the one big benefit of open sourcing something, which is marketing. Developers love having the ability to look at the code of products that they use, even if 90% of them don't ever have the intention of actually going through it. If a company is willing to open source their code base, that's a sign of good faith. At least 95% of the time, they're not doing anything sketchy. So if I'm looking at two products and one of them is open source and they're relatively equivalent, I'm going to pick the open source product every single time. Note, this only really carries weight with tech people and more specifically developers. So if that's not your demographic, marketing it as open source is going to do absolutely nothing for you. This is kind of a minor thing, but if your project does start to pop off a little bit, it will be shown in the GitHub trending page. And so even more developers will be exposed to it. But to be honest, I don't even know how valuable that even is. I've heard some people say that when you open source a project, it helps with security because there's more eyeballs looking at it. But for me, I've had the opposite experience, because the person that is going to be studying your code the most for vulnerabilities is the person that wants to hack it. You can minimize hackers doing malicious things by offering a bug bounty, but I think in general, when you open source your code, it makes it easier to hack. We had a situation where we were using a regular expression to restrict domains, and somebody looked at how the regular expression was written, found that there was a bug in it. They then purchased a domain and basically abused it based on that. If the code wasn't publicly available, the vulnerability still would have been there, but it would be much harder to find and then abuse it. But Ben, if I open source my startup, can I still make money with it? The answer is yes, and lots of companies do it. But you just need to make sure that your value proposition is at 100% tied to your code. For Dogehouse, anyone could spin up their own instance, but it would be missing the community of people that are using my instance, dogehouse.tv, and that is where the value comes from. The default monetization strategy that pretty much every open source project uses is just to have a hosted version that's more convenient than people trying to run the code themselves. In talking with investors, none of them were put off with Dogehouse being open source, and some of them even preferred it. If your business model doesn't conflict with showing your code to the world, it's usually an advantage to do so. One other perk is translations. Dogehouse was translated into a bunch of different languages thanks to the help of native speakers from around the world and a couple of scrubs that were copy pasting stuff from Google Translations. The TLDR is, if I'm working on a startup that involves developers in any way, and it doesn't use any proprietary knowledge like big brain machine learning stuff, and business model is compatible, then I'm going to open source it. Otherwise, I'm not. If I was going to start Dogehouse from scratch, I would definitely open source it again. The project makes a lot of sense to be open source. The only thing I would change is probably do it with a co-founder. You can finally get a haircut. Look, Eric, I've got a mop on my head right now. I don't understand it either, but girls love it. Trust me on this one. Grow out your hair, Eric. It's going to do wonders for you. Lastly, I'm holding an art contest for Benawad merch. The winners will have their choice of $100 or a 30-minute Zoom call with me. Anything is fair game, so if you're artistically inclined, upload your designs to the subreddit. Otherwise, if you're like me and artistically challenged, check out the subreddit and upvote your favorite designs that you want to see on a t-shirt. Deadline is June 16th.